My daughter looked at me like I was a stranger the morning. I told her I didn't trust the man she was about to marry. That look, I still think about it. 63 years on this earth, and nothing has ever cut me quite like that. Not the accident in '94 that took 2 fingers on my left hand. Not the night my wife passed. Not even the years I spent rebuilding everything from scratch after the mill closed. None of it. Just that look, like everything I'd ever been to her had been erased in the time it took her to say, "Dad, you don't even know him." Maybe she was right. But I knew enough. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I spent 31 years as a structural engineer in Western Pennsylvania, raised 2 kids mostly on my own after my wife got sick, and I built a small but decent life on the principle that a man's word and a man's actions should match up. When they don't, I notice. It's not a gift. It's just what happens when you've read enough blueprints to know that the crack you can barely see on the surface is usually the one that'll bring the whole structure down. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's who she is and that's all you need to know. She's 31, bright, stubborn in the best way, got her mother's laugh and her mother's impatience, and Lord knows she got my ability to dig her heels in and refuse to move. She works in hospital administration in Columbus. She's good at her job. She's the kind of person who remembers everyone's birthday and somehow manages to be the most organized person in any room she walks into. She met him at a work conference in Cincinnati. He was presenting something about healthcare finance consulting. She called me that night, still in her hotel room, voice different than I'd heard it in years. Lighter. She said, "Dad, I just met someone, and I don't know, I just think he might be different." I was happy for her. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely, completely happy for her. His name was, let me just call him what my daughter called him, her fiancé, because that's what he became. About 14 months after that phone call, when he got down on one knee at a restaurant in Columbus, and she called me from the parking lot crying so hard she could barely get the words out. She was happy, really happy. And I told her I was happy too. That part was still true then. I met him for the first time at Thanksgiving. 6 weeks after the engagement, my daughter drove down from Columbus, and he flew in from wherever he'd been that week. He traveled constantly for work, which I understood, but there was always something slightly theatrical about the way he talked about it. Every trip was to somewhere impressive. Every client was enormous. Every deal was consequential. He had a way of describing his own life that made it sound like a highlight reel, and I kept waiting for the ordinary parts, and they never came. He was charming. I'll give him that. He shook my hand firm, remembered details I'd mentioned in passing, and brought them back up later in the conversation. Made my daughter laugh 3 times before we even sat down to eat. He complimented my house without being sycophantic about it, asked real questions about my engineering work, and helped clear the table without being asked. On paper, he was everything. But there was a moment, just one, and it lasted maybe 4 seconds, where he didn't know I was watching him. My daughter had gone to the kitchen to deal with something, and my son-in-law-to-be was sitting at the table with his phone in his hand, and the expression on his face was not the expression he wore when other people were looking. It was flat, calculating, almost, like someone running numbers. Then my daughter came back, and the warmth returned instantly, like a light switching on. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like an old man looking for reasons to disapprove of the man his daughter loves. I told myself that for weeks. I replayed that 4 seconds over and over and asked myself whether I was being fair, whether I was projecting, whether I was just struggling to accept that my daughter had built a life that didn't center on me anymore. I decided I was being unfair. I let it go. I wish I'd trusted my gut. The engagement moved quickly. She wanted a June wedding. He wanted whatever she wanted, which she found romantic, and I found slightly odd. Most people have at least one opinion about their own wedding. The venue got booked, a deposit on a reception hall outside Columbus that cost more than my first car, and the planning went into full gear. My daughter was luminous through all of it. She sent me photos of flower arrangements and seating charts, and I told her everything looked beautiful because it did. In February, about 4 months before the wedding, she called me on a Tuesday night. I remember it was Tuesday because I'd just gotten back from my standing dinner with my old colleague Vince, and I was still in my coat when the phone rang. She sounded strange. Not upset, exactly, More like someone trying to convince herself that a thing that bothered her actually didn't. She said he'd mentioned, almost in passing, that he thought they should combine their finances before the wedding, move everything into a joint account. She'd suggested waiting until after they were married, and he'd gotten, she searched for the word, a little intense about it, said he felt like separate accounts signaled a lack of trust, said if she trusted him, this shouldn't be a big deal. I kept my voice very even. I asked her how she felt about it. She said she didn't know. She said she was probably overthinking it. I said, you can take your time with financial decisions. Anyone who loves you will understand that. She said, I know, in a way that meant she didn't want to talk about it anymore, so I didn't push. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The next morning, I called a man I'd known for 22 years, a private investigator out of Pittsburgh named Walt Cribbs, who I'd used exactly once before, when my business partner in a side investment turned out to be less straightforward than advertised. Walt was 68, mostly retired, but he still took cases when they interested him. I'd never thought I'd be calling him about my daughter's fiancé. I told Walt what I knew. Name, employer, city, general background. I told him I didn't know what I was looking for. I just wanted to know if there was anything to find. Walt said, give me 2 weeks. I went back to my life and tried not to think about it. I called my daughter and asked about the wedding. I drove down to Columbus in March for a cake tasting and sat at a little table while she and her fiancé debated the merits of lemon versus almond, and he was charming and attentive, and I smiled and said the lemon was wonderful. The whole time I was there, I was looking for the face he made when nobody was watching. I saw it twice. Walt called me on a Thursday evening in late March. He didn't open with pleasantries, which wasn't unusual for Walt. He said, your instincts are good. I put down the glass of water I was holding. He had found a woman in Scottsdale, Arizona. She was 38 years old, and she had been married to my daughter's fiancé, legally married, in Maricopa County, for 11 months before the marriage was dissolved in 2019. She had no idea he was engaged. Walt had spoken to her, carefully, without revealing too much. She said the marriage had ended because she discovered he had been siphoning money from her personal savings account over a period of 8 months. Small amounts at first, then larger, always just under the thresholds that would trigger automatic bank alerts. When she found it, she confronted him. He denied it. She had documentation. He left. He had never been charged. She hadn't pursued it criminally, partly because the amounts were recoverable, partly because she just wanted him gone. There was something else. Walt had also found a woman in Nashville. Not a marriage this time. A long engagement, 2 years, ended in 2016. The pattern was similar. Financial pressure early in the relationship, a push toward combined accounts, anomalous withdrawals. This woman had pursued a civil claim and settled out of court. My daughter's fiancé had done this before, maybe twice, possibly more. I sat with that information for 4 days, and I didn't sleep much during any of them. I want to be honest about what those 4 days were like, because I think people assume that when you find out something like this, you snap into action. You make calls, you confront people, you fix it. But that's not how it felt. It felt like I was standing at the top of a very steep set of stairs in the dark, and I could either reach for the light switch or I could try to take a step and hope I didn't fall. My daughter loved this man. She was 2.5 months away from marrying him. Her dress had been fitted. Her invitations had gone out. Her face when she called me from that parking lot in Columbus, that sound she made, half lawing, half crying, saying, Dad, I think he's it. I think he's actually it. That was real. Her happiness was real. And I was about to be the person who detonated it. I called my son, who lives in Phoenix, on the 4th night. He's younger than my daughter by 4 years, and they've always been close. I told him everything. He went quiet for a long time. He said, how sure is Walt? I said, sure enough. He said, then you have to tell her. I said, I know. He said, she's going to be devastated. I said, I know. He said, Dad, you have to tell her. I know, I said, I know. I drove to Columbus on a Saturday in early April. I didn't call ahead. My daughter opened the door and looked at my face and said, what happened? Is it your heart? Because I'd had a small cardiac event 3 years ago, and she still worried. I said, no. I said we needed to sit down. We sat at her kitchen table. Her fiancé was at a conference in Atlanta. I told her everything Walt had found. I was methodical about it. I laid it out the way I would have laid out findings in an engineering report. The sources, the timeline, the pattern. I didn't editorialize. I didn't say I always had a feeling. I just gave her the facts. She was completely still the entire time I was talking. When I finished, she said, "Where did you get this?" I told her about Walt. She said, "You hired someone to investigate my fiancé." I said yes. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a long time with her back to me, and I could see her shoulders moving, and I knew she was crying, and I didn't move because I didn't know if she wanted me to. Finally, she turned around, and her face was, I don't have the right word for it. It wasn't angry yet. It was more like someone trying to do complicated math in their head. She asked me how long I'd known about Walt's involvement. I told her. She asked if I'd been waiting until I had enough before I told her. And I said yes. She said, "So you let me keep planning the wedding while you were sitting on this?" I said, "I needed to be sure before I brought you something that would change your life." "I didn't want to be wrong." She said, "What if he has an explanation?" I said I thought she deserved the chance to find out. She asked me to leave, not unkindly. She just said she needed to be alone, and I said of course, and I hugged her at the door. She let me, and I drove 2 hours back to Pennsylvania and sat in my kitchen again and stared at the wall. She called him in Atlanta that night. I don't know everything that was said because she hasn't told me all of it, and I haven't asked. What I do know is that she confronted him with the specifics, and he denied everything initially. And when she told him she had documentation, the denial shifted, became a version of events where everything was a misunderstanding, where the woman in Scottsdale had misrepresented the situation, where the civil case in Nashville was fabricated by someone who had an agenda against him. She told him she needed space to verify things for herself. He did not handle that well. Over the next 72 hours, he called her 29 times. He showed up at her apartment on the second day. She didn't answer the door, but she could hear him in the hallway. He sent her an 11-page email that she described to me as simultaneously an apology and an accusation. He reached out to 3 of her friends and her work colleague to tell them she was going through a mental health episode triggered by her father's interference. That last part made something clarify for me. Because men who have done nothing wrong don't spend 72 hours trying to control the story. They get hurt, they get angry maybe, but they don't manage. And this man was managing. My daughter contacted the woman in Scottsdale herself. Walt had provided contact information, and she used it. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. Afterward, she called me and said, "She described things, Dad, specific things, that I've seen." I said, "I know." She said, "I need you to help me talk to someone. A lawyer, I think." I said, "I've already looked into it. I can send you 3 names. She made a sound that was almost like a laugh. She said, "Of course you did." The wedding was canceled 11 weeks before it was scheduled to happen. My daughter handled it with more grace than I could have managed. She notified the venue, the caterer, the photographer. She returned the gifts. She wrote personal notes to people she felt deserved more than an email. It cost her emotionally in ways I could see, and in ways I probably couldn't. But she did it methodically, one task at a time, the same way her mother used to approach things that were too hard to look at all at once. The reaction from some people was exactly what you'd expect. A few mutual friends sided with him, believed the mental health episode story, or chose to believe it because it was simpler. Her fiancé, to no one's surprise, pivoted quickly to victimhood. He told people she'd had cold feet and invented a story to get out of the engagement. He told people I was a controlling father who had poisoned the relationship. He told people a lot of things. What he didn't do was pursue any legal action, because men who pursue legal action have to answer questions under oath, and he didn't want to answer questions under oath. There's something I want to say about the months that followed, because I think this is the part people skip over when they tell stories like this. They go straight from the revelation to the resolution, and they leave out the middle part, which is where most of the actual living happens. My daughter grieved. I want to be clear about that. She didn't bounce back in 2 weeks with a new outlook on life. She grieved the relationship, the future she'd imagined, the version of herself that was going to be someone's wife. She went to therapy, something I was proud of her for because she'd resisted it for years. She had hard months. She called me sometimes just to be quiet on the phone together, and I'd sit on my end and not say anything and just be there. She also got angry, not just at him, at herself, for not seeing it, and sometimes at me, which was fair. She said once, about 6 months out, "I know you were right, and I hate that you were right, and I wish you hadn't been." I said I wish that too. I meant it. What I didn't tell her, and haven't told many people, is what I did a few months after the wedding was canceled. The woman in Scottsdale had not pressed criminal charges. Neither had the woman from Nashville. But between Walt's findings and the documentation my daughter's lawyer had compiled, there was enough for a formal complaint to the state attorney's office. Not a guarantee of prosecution, but a submission of evidence that would go into a file that would stay open. Walt helped me put together the submission. We were careful about it. Thorough. I spent a weekend at Walt's kitchen table going through every document, every timestamp, every transaction record he'd been able to obtain. We made sure the women in Scottsdale and Nashville were aware of it and had the option to add their own accounts if they chose to. The woman in Scottsdale chose to add hers. I don't know what will come of it. These things move slowly, and sometimes they don't move at all. But the file exists. His name is in it, and if he does this to someone else, and men like him usually do, there's a record now that will make the next woman's situation easier to prove. That's the part that matters to me most. Not the satisfaction of it, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't any. What matters is that the next woman might have a shorter road. My daughter is doing better. More than better, actually. She got a promotion in the fall. She's been spending more time with her friends, which she'd neglected during the engagement. She took a trip to Portugal with her college roommate in November and sent me pictures from Lisbon that I have printed out on my refrigerator. She still talks to the woman from Scottsdale sometimes. They became, in a strange way, something like friends. Two people connected by an experience neither of them asked for, who found it useful not to be alone with it. Last Christmas, my daughter and my son both came home. We had my daughter's closest friend over, and my son's wife, and her 2 kids who are at the age where everything is hilarious and nothing is serious. And we ate too much and watched something terrible on television, and my daughter fell asleep on the couch at 9:30 with her shoes still on, the way she used to when she was little. I sat there in that room and looked at my family and thought about the version of Christmas that would have existed if I hadn't called Walt, if I'd talked myself out of my instincts, if I'd decided that being liked by my daughter's fiancé mattered more than telling her the truth. She might have found out eventually anyway. She might not have. Either way, there would have been a cost. I'm not telling this story because I want credit. I'm telling it because I know there are other fathers out there, and mothers, and brothers and friends, who are sitting with something they noticed and talking themselves out of it, who are deciding that the relationship is more important than the concern, that the timing is wrong, that they don't have enough to go on, that they'll just wait and see. Sometimes waiting and seeing is wisdom, and sometimes it's fear dressed up as respect. I sat in my kitchen for 4 days. I almost convinced myself it wasn't my place. I'm glad I drove to Columbus.